All right, welcome everyone. I'm excited to be here tonight, and I'm glad we have such a pretty strong turnout for a Wednesday night in the summer when everybody is often traveling and busy. So I really appreciate your time tonight. Today I'm going to talk to you about um, mostly drawing from a paper that I collaborated on with I don't know, 25 other scientists all over the world and looked at different lake restoration techniques. And then I'll tell you a little bit about some of my own work in Grand Lake St. Mary's, which, as you can see by this picture, with the little mesocosms my student had going, is pretty afflicted with harmful algal blooms. So, as you know, but just to point out, HABs are a global problem. We see them in the Great Lakes, we see them in inland lakes, we see them at most many latitudes right now. I've worked as far north as Finland and as far south as Lake Okeechobee, but they're definitely much farther south than that as well. Um, and in Michigan, if you weren't familiar with this website, which I hope you are, but if you're not, this is from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, and this is showing all of their blooms from 2022 to 2024. So the policy right now is basically if you see something, say something, because there isn't enough human power to sample all the lakes at any given, week in the summer. And so when things are reported, they go and test. And if they found cyanobacteria, the color is yellow. And if they confirmed that cyanodioxins were detected, the color is red. And when I started doing this, all the yellow and red were down, sort of on parallel of Lansing or south, and they are creeping up north as things warm up. So cyanobacteria really like it hot. And the warmer it is, the happier they are, and the earlier it gets warm, the sooner they are showing up. So today we're going to talk about different possible treatments for cyanobacterial blooms in your lake. But the first key, and I think that the other speakers have really spoken to this, is that every lake is different, and you really need to understand a lot of things about your lake. We'll talk about some of them in a minute, but nutrient budgets, what the shape of your lake is, what the shoreline is like, if the shoreline can be improved. There are many, many, many factors to take into consideration when coming up with a plan for lake treatment. There is a strong relationship between how a lake is shaped and how deep it is and how likely it is to experience harmful algal blooms. In general, large or small, but shallow, warm lakes tend to be prime for cyanobacteria if there's high external nutrient loading, because then you can have both external external nutrients coming in and then internal release from the sediments. We call it benthic pelagic interaction, but it basically just means that everything is a problem and there's no part of the water that's like away from the surface that doesn't get mixed in a really shallow lake. And so those tend to be the most prime for harmful algal blooms, like the western basin of Lake Erie, or like I said, Lake Okeechobee in Florida, big flat shallow lakes. But other lakes can get them too. And if you have a lake that is so shallow that it doesn't stratify, it's especially prone to harmful algal blooms. And so what that means is stratification, if you don't know, lakes normally set up in the summer, it's probably easiest to think about it when it's really warm outside. The top layer of a lake is always going to get warm just like the air temperature, but the bottom layer of a lake, if it's deep enough, will stay cool. It stays about 4 degrees Celsius all summer, which is also true in winter, which, fun fact, that's why fish can survive in lakes over the winter because even if it's really frozen, ice covered, very cold on top, even too cold for the fish, they can live in the bottom of the lake and be fine. But in the summer, that bottom of the lake stays cool and the top of the lake gets warm, and there's something called a thermocline that sets up. And if you look at the graph over on the right side over here, you can see that the oxygen is going to follow the temperature. So where we have really warm water that is interacting with the surface, there's still plenty of oxygen. And as the temperature changes, there actually becomes a density change in the water so that the water in the bottom and the water in the top can't really interact. And we call that a pycnocline. It's also a thermocline. So that's a temperature decline. And then there's something called an oxycline too. So basically, you have higher oxygenated water, and then you can get anoxic water here at the bottom. That's really important because anoxia releases phosphorus from what it's bound to, like iron or aluminum, and then you get a bunch of dissolved phosphorus and ammonium in the bottom of the lake. And so, like, I worked in the Finger Lakes for a while, and there were a lot of lakes that seemed fine, but then they would get these periodic microcystis blooms. And what happened was the lake was super deep and it was set up like this. But if a storm came along or yeah, a really heavy storm event was usually the deal. And it would actually either cool off the top of the lake or physically, with wind, mix the lake down. It would bring that nutrient-laden water up from the bottom and cause a harmful algal bloom. Anyway, so understanding the morphometry of your lake, how it's shaped, does it stratify, how many nutrients are coming from that internal supply, when are they coming, why are they coming, really helps set up the treatment plan for the lake. And so you really need to know your nutrient budget and need to understand how much sediment release of phosphorus and nitrogen is there, how much is coming in from external loading, how much is coming in from tributaries, what's going on in those watersheds, what's the cause of them. A lot of times in the southern part of Michigan, we have pretty heavily agricultural watersheds, and when you get up to the tip of the mitt, it's all really forested, but you do have a lot of septic tanks, for example. So just trying to understand where are your nutrients coming from, what's the land use associated with those nutrients, and how are they getting into the lake? Are they coming in through a tributary? Is it literal just straight rain going in, which is it has some nitrogen in it, but it's not that high. All right. So I just want to preface this by saying that usually the best treatment for a lake is to reduce external nutrients. That's not always true, but most of the time, the best way to remove your harmful algal bloom is to stop external nutrients going into the lake. On the other hand, that is easier said than done, and there are a lot of social, economic, political factors that can prevent that from happening. Or there are a lot of places like, for example, the Lake Erie watershed, where there are a lot of farmers working on it, but trying to get that many people across that big of an area to install that many new management practices that may cost them money and may not be proven yet to their satisfaction to work, can be a really big undertaking. And in the meantime, you might be stuck with a lake that has really toxic algae blooms. And so, what do you do in the meantime? And so, I just, again, these are all band-aids. None of them are long-term solutions, but they're worth discussing because sometimes we find ourselves in need of a band-aid. So, again, because sediments can release phosphorus when, especially when there's anoxic water over it, it can just basically release all the internal pee from it. One way of dealing with that is to dredge the top of the surface. It can work in small and shallow lakes. Theoretically, it removes both nitrogen and phosphorus from the surface and can be effective, but it can be incredibly expensive. It's bad for benthic invertebrates, macrophytes, fish, toxic compounds in the sediment. We have a bunch of no lakes in northern Michigan that used to be in industrial watersheds and still have mercury in them. Um, and in the case of a lake I worked in China, they dredged the bottom of the lake and then put it literally in a pile right next to the lake, and it rained and washed back into the lake. So can be less effective for that. Lots of people, especially with very small ponds, tend to be very fond of algicides, especially copper sulfate. That is this characteristic bright blue color here. It can elevate copper levels when you use that, which is, again, so bad for human health in that the lead and copper rule is lead and copper, as in copper, high copper levels are tend to be bad for human consumption. So if it contaminates your drinking water, it can make you very sick. And it indiscriminately kills not all, including, or not just all algae, but also zooplankton, macrophytes. So all the things that form the base of the food web basically die when you use copper sulfate. So if you want a pond that has literally nothing alive in it, it is a good option. Other than that, it is really not a great option. So, one way to prevent that lake from stratifying is if you have a not super deep lake, like the Kettle Hole lakes we have in northern Michigan that are, 80 meters deep, probably not a good option here. But if you're just deeper than shallow and you have a small sort of anoxic layer at the bottom that becomes a problem that starts releasing phosphorus and nitrogen, you can actually aerate the water with these bubblers. And if internal phosphorus is a big cause of your problem, this is actually a pretty decent way to do it. It can be expensive though, unless you're able to hook it to solar or wind powered aerators, and then the upfront cost is cheap, but the maintenance or more expensive, but the maintenance is really much cheaper. Um, Powering them though on conventional electricity can be a little more expensive, but it's I would say generally relatively environmentally friendly. So, in the case of some lakes, like the one I'm going to talk about in a minute, Green Lake, a big contributor to harmful algae blooms is the fact that the water can be really turbid. And when it's turbid, it's hard for things that are photosynthesizing to get enough light to be able to grow. And sometimes the cause of that turbidity is carp, invasive carp. So, in the case of Casey Lake in Wisconsin, um, the lake is like many lakes in the Midwest, not so much in Michigan, but in other parts of the Midwest, actually a reservoir. And so they can draw down the water in the winter and they then spring and net do electrofishing surveys to pretty much kill all of the carp. This is called biomanipulation. It can be effective in small to medium lakes. It's usually a good thing to do after you've reduced external nutrient loads. So if you reduced your external nutrient loads and you're still having a problem, and it's because your water is really turbid, and only algae that grow in turbid water, like planktothrix, for example, are really happy and they make a lot of toxin, you can remove your carp this way. And it's actually relatively low cost, and there's pretty few environmental risks for doing it this way. But it has to be shallow enough that you can actually kill all the carp with electrofishing. Another thing that people like to do a lot is macrophyte removal. And that is basically people don't like weeds. They don't like weeds because they get caught in their boat propellers. They don't like touching them when they swim. They think they're unsightly. People tend to dislike vegetation, although, as you heard from our previous speakers, they can actually be really good. So the thing is, if you have a lot of external nutrients coming into your lake, stuff is going to grow. And you can basically have your choice between algae or weeds. And personally, I'd rather have the weeds because they're not toxic. And so dealing with them, though, can be an issue. And I've seen lakes where the water level does go down in later, like in the late summer, early fall, and they just literally go and mow, and that works super well. Um, in Casey Lake again in Wisconsin, when the water was drawn down, they were able to use a paddle wheel mechanical harvester. And it's really important that I'm talking about things that involve cutting or like mowing the weeds as opposed to yanking them out by the roots. Because when you yank them out by the roots, you not only release a bunch of sediment into the water and can cause this high turbidity, but again, you get a trade-off here of weeds for algae. So if you pull out all of your weeds, you might end up with a toxic algae bloom. But if you're just able to sort of trim the weeds or mow the weeds, then it takes them a while to grow back, and in the time that's growing back, you have your nice clear water to boat and play in. I mean, there's a trade-off there in that you have to keep doing it a lot, but it is um, much safer in terms of preventing algae blooms. There's another option I haven't seen a lot in the US, but I have seen it a lot more in Europe. And if you have a lake that's deep enough that you have that anoxic water at the bottom and it's too deep to put in aerators, there's something called hypolimnetic withdrawal. And it does involve paying for the electricity for a pump, but I've seen it be pretty successful. So the idea is that if internal nutrient loads are your big issue and they happen in that anoxic bottom water, you can take a pump and you can pump the water out to basically a constructed wetland next to the lake. It can either be, you can have a more mechanical treatment, or you can just basically put it through a constructed wetland, have it remove the nitrogen and phosphorus. You can also pair more mechanical treatments or chemical treatments with wetlands. And then you can let the water flow back into the lake. So it's the expense of pumping it out, the initial expense of building it, but it does treat it pretty well and then put it back into the lake. And if you have to pump, it's definitely more expensive, but there are places where you can just have sort of gravity flow, and that's a lot cheaper. And it has pretty little environmental risk. You could potentially have water that's rich in metals or nutrients coming out of it, which is not great, but I mean, the idea is to remove the nutrients, so hopefully it's fine. Anyway, and a friend of mine in Finland worked on Lake Kimijärvi, and that's the example that you're seeing here. Okay, and then there's everybody's favorite pea binding treatments. You heard about a pretty successful application earlier. Here I'm going to talk about both an alum and a Foslock application that were not successful. And I will explain to you why they weren't successful. But I will really say that they can be very successful, as you just saw from Jim. So the difference between Foslock and alum is that alum is aluminum sulfate, and it's an older treatment, but it can still be very effective. It's a lot cheaper than Foslock. Foslock is lanthanum, and it has a much stronger binding affinity to phosphorus. And aluminum sulfate, still, if you get a low enough pH or low enough oxygen, can release that phosphorus back from the aluminum. And lanthanum hangs on to it pretty tightly, almost no matter what. I tried to get it to burst out in the lab, and it you can make it happen, but it would have to, I mean, you basically wouldn't have anything else alive in the lake for the conditions it takes to release it from lanthanum. So it does theoretically last longer. It's also a lot more expensive. And I'm going to talk to you about a lake in Ohio called Grand Lake St. Mary's. Calling it a lake is a little bit generous in that it was dug by, I don't know, oxen and hand back in the mid 1800s to be a recreational area for wealthy people. And then they discovered that there was oil in the lake, and so they drilled it for a long time. But when I say they dug it, I mean they dug it. This is basically a big swimming pool. There was no natural shoreline whatsoever, no natural vegetation, no nice littoral zone, not even cattails, nothing. And after years and years and years of being in this very heavily agricultural watershed, it started getting pretty terrible, harmful algae blooms. When I was a kid in the 80s, this was a great place to go and boat. By the time it was the early 2000s, it was really not so much anymore. But it is also the drinking water source for the city of Salina. It is the second most toxic drinking water source in the U.S., and the city of Salina's water treatment plant is a thing of beauty, which I would be happy to talk about at some other time. They do a great job at filtering out algae. So my colleague here, so the Wright State Lake campus is literally located on Grand Lake St. Mary's in Ohio, and I've worked there for a number of years now with my colleague Stephen Jackman there. And basically, what happened is that the HAB in 2011 got so bad, and by bad, I mean, if these numbers mean anything to you, and it's still true, more than 300 milligrams per liter of chlorophyll, and often up to 80 micrograms per liter, sorry, milligrams, yeah, micrograms per liter of microcystin as well. So, almost every year there's a no contact advisory because of the microcystin in addition to because of E. coli, and it was kind of a hot mess. So they did one algae or one alum treatment in 2011, but they tried to do it for the whole lake and they ran out of money, and they basically only did it in part of the lake, and it really just it didn't work. And so that's the first thing is this lake is really too big for alum to work successfully at the kind of budget that is likely to be available to a community this size, unfortunately, and definitely not Foslock. And so you can see here is our microcystins getting up to and above, 75 micrograms per liter. This is just any sort of, this is an average of 10 years or so, and it's just looking at any given week of the year. And then here it is by year, and you can see that there were really, really high microcystins in spring and summer, and they've sort of dropped down in the last couple years, hopefully due to all of the treatments in the watershed in response to that original algae bloom. It was declared an distressed watershed, and that has legal ramifications in the state of Ohio that compel farmers to do soil phosphorus testing, limit the phosphorus that they add, store the manure from in an actual manure storage shed or barn so it doesn't just run off in a pile or in a lagoon. And it seems to be working. There are a lot of other management practices in place there too. So Grand Lake has this tiny corner, this little park here, and there's something called Dogtail Lake, which now has two arms here. It's a little enclosure within the lake. You can see these two arms in the left picture extending past each other, and it's hard to tell, but these two little dots here are a curtain that extends across the arm. So it is technically enclosed, but by enclosed, I mean they dropped a bunch of cement pylons on top of each other and then some gravel over it and hoped that it would fill in. But water finds a way, and my colleague Stephen did a big Kool-Aid test one year, just went out and just dumped a bunch of Kool-Aid in the water and watched how long it took for the color to go out, and it was about 3 days. So the exchange between the lake and the enclosure is somewhere between 3 days and a week, to be generous. Um, and they decided to go ahead with the treatment anyway. Okay. Anyway, so Grand Lake St. Mary's, huge, huge, huge external nutrient loads, like in the 90th percentile for concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen. So there's just tons of new nutrients coming in pretty much at any given moment into this lake almost all the time. But they really wanted to be able to swim in it, so they thought, hey, we'll try treating this little enclosure here. And it was successful in one way that they didn't predict, in that there was a time, was it in late 2020, when the oxygen got low enough in the water that there was actually a fish kill. You can see it was really, really gross here in July 2020. These are all dead fish. Um, and there was no fish kill within the enclosure because they aerate the enclosure, which was interesting. So this enclosure, they wanted it for swimming. It's a little sketchy for that. They were trying to treat it later, and the treatments didn't work, but aeration does work within it, and it protected the fish within the enclosure, and they didn't die. So that's good. But then they wanted to be able to swim in it, so they did these pea binding treatments. First, they tried alum, and when that didn't work, the following year they went, whole hog all in and tried lanthanum or Foslock treatments. So in May of 2021, it was supposed to be April oh, sorry, the first original alum application was supposed to be in April of 2020, but had to get postponed because COVID, so it didn't happen until June. They dosed about 5,200 pounds of aluminum sulfate. They judged that's what they would need to treat all of the phosphorus that was in the enclosure. And then I'll show you, but that didn't really work. And so the following year, they said, okay, we're going to go Foslock, and we're going to do it 3 to 4 weeks apart. And we decided that June was too late because most of the pea was probably already inside the algae. So when they dosed it with the alum, there just wasn't that much free phosphorus to bind to it. So they thought they'd pair it with an algicide to break open the cells, and then there'd be all the phosphorus available. And then it would bind to the aluminum, and they would do it, every 3 to 4 weeks throughout the summer, and hopefully it would last long enough so that people could swim in between. And I'm not really going to make you look at this graph. I just wanted to show you that basically in 2020 there was this one alum treatment, and then in 2021 they had these series of these 4 alum treatments paired with the algicide. Um, and so if you look here on these graphs, you see the alum treatment on the upper left-hand corner, and everything else is a Foslock treatment. And it shows you what's happening in the enclosure and then what's happening in the lake. And it shows you the total phosphorus. And the before is in sort of an orangey red color, and the after is in kind of a bluey greeny color. What we can see is that after the alum treatment and occasionally after a Foslock treatment in the enclosure, you do see a big drop immediately in terms of total phosphorus, but by each of these dots is pretty much a week. And so by 2 to 3 weeks after it, so this is right after, and then a week after and 2 weeks after, the total phosphorus has just gone way back up. And when we look at the statistics for the significant difference between these for both phosphorus, now we're looking at chlorophyll. Chlorophyll goes down, but it comes right back up, and it's not actually significantly different from the lake by 2 weeks out. And so, in general, there was just really no longevity to the effect of the treatment. It did work immediately. Like the following 3 days looked great. But because there was such a strong interaction with the lake, and because the lake has such high levels of phosphorus in it, it just pretty much immediately brought the bloom back within a week. So the pea binding did reduce total phosphorus in the enclosure immediately, but not for more than a week or two. Um, this lake just has really strong external nutrient loads, and the lake has really high concentrations in exchange with the enclosure. And this is a bit of an extreme example, but I think my point is that if you treated a lake even that was small enough to be appropriately treated with alum or lanthanum, if you have a lot of water coming in that has phosphorus in it, you're just going to have an algae bloom to begin with. That's why it's really important to have a nutrient budget to understand, is your internal phosphorus your main source or external? And if it's internal, then phosphorus treatment seems like a good idea. If it's external, then probably not. And so, um, my take homes for you then are that every lake is different, and you need to understand your lake, the morphometry, the shoreline, the depth, the watershed land use, and then use it to make a nutrient budget. Understand how much of your nutrients are external, how much is internal. And the best treatment, if it's external, is to reduce the external sources. But if you can't do that, then your in-lake treatment really needs to be customized. And often there could be a combination of these things. So in Grand Lake, that I was just showing you, yeah, the phosphorus treatment in the enclosure didn't work, but working with the farmers to reduce nutrient loading, adding in littoral zone filters and wetlands and other ways of filtering the external nutrients coming in are all really starting to reduce the nutrient load to the lake. And once it has, we'll need to do a carp treatment too. Because, often these things are best used in combination with each other. And the question is really which combinations work the best. All right. Now I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sylvia. That was a really good overview of some of the options that are in the menu for people who are trying to handle blooms and algae issues.
All right. So, James. How do you test to see how much is internal loading versus external loading? Well, to understand the external loading, you need to know two things. What's the water budget and what's the concentration of the nutrients of stuff coming in? I mean, the best way is to be able to measure the water that's coming into the lake, and you usually need pretty constant, we call it discharge, is the volume of water coming in. So the USGS has gauge stations all over the US, and they may or may not have one on a tributary coming into your lake. If they don't, there are ways to set one up that aren't terribly expensive. And you can sort of estimate it too. And then you'd need to have water sampling, preferably weekly plus storms. So you'd need someone to go out and at least collect a bottle of water, basically, and then you can send it off for, depends on if you want total or dissolved, but you can send it off for total phosphorus and nitrogen relatively easily. Easily, if you did that for a year, you would understand your whole year of how much nutrients are coming in and when. And for internal nutrient loads, um, well, how I test it is I go out and I take a sediment core, which is not actually very hard to make or build. You just sort of, take a clear tube basically and you plug it in the water and you pull it back out. And then we let it sit over time, and we actually put sort of a cap on it, and we see when the oxygen goes down, how much phosphorus comes out. We do nitrogen too. But you'd have to do that in a lot of places sort of over time, and then you could have enough information to make your determination of internal versus external. Yeah, benthic mats. Well, I mean, benthic mats don't make phosphorus, so I'm not entirely sure what you mean by that, Kelly. Um, storms, water will no. So both alum and Foslock essentially form a cap. It's almost like hard to the touch. It's a precipitate that's basically, I mean, not that different actually from your teeth. Apatite is a phosphorus mineral that makes up your teeth, and that it basically forms that on the surface of the lake. So, I mean, on the surface of the sediment at the bottom of the lake. And so it really, it they call it a cap to the sediment, and it is hard to the touch, and it prevents exchange of nutrients back out into the water column. If the lake bottom is high in sediment, wouldn't it make the column more cloudy? That's interesting. Well, I mean, there's always going to be a lot of sediment in the lake, and I think it depends on where you put your bubblers or aerators. I mean, I probably wouldn't put it right, right on the bottom. Um, I think it probably depends on where is what kind of bubbler it is, where it's situated, and you'd want to test it first to make sure you weren't churning up the sediments. I've seen a lot that are sort of a little higher up in the water column, and they're pretty good at mixing, without disturbing the sediment cap.
Sylvia, there's a couple of questions, people wondering about timber char or biochar. Is that something you're familiar with, and do you know what the mechanism for that would be?
So I was actually just talking about this last week at the bio station with somebody, and I'm not familiar with biochar specifically, but activated carbon in general, that's what's in your Brita filter, right? So if you have any kind of filter that has activated carbon in it, it will bind to any kind of ions going through it, phosphorus, nitrogen, whatever, and it can filter out your water that way. So you can definitely have, that's what I was talking about, more chemical filter options. People also make them with iron to bind the phosphorus. Oddly enough, people make them with wood chips for the nitrogen, not because it binds it, but because it hosts the bacteria that remove the nitrogen from the water. Um, so yeah, I haven't seen biochar in action. I have heard about it. I assume it works like any other activated carbon filter.
So, as you've heard mentioned a few times, there is a lot of information available about HABs. So make sure first that if you do see something you think might be a harmful algal bloom to report it. So you can report it directly to this algae bloom at michigan.gov email. Please send photos because that really helps the folks that get that email figure out. As you saw in some of the pictures, you can't always figure out if it's a harmful algal bloom from the photo, but it really helps. So send that along to them. And then if you're looking for viewing past data or current data, this map, Michigan map, is updated weekly. So you can view updates. But just remember the best idea is always use what your eyes are telling you. So when in doubt, stay out. And make sure you and your family and friends and your pets, especially, there have been dogs that have died in Michigan from being exposed to harmful algal blooms, can all stay safe. So check out more information on this michigan.gov/HABs website. It includes a picture guide about HABs and a little video that shows you someone actually doing a test to tell whether it's filamentous algae or not. It also has a number of frequently asked questions about HABs. And then Michigan Sea Grant also has our HABs 101 resources page. So this includes a lot of resources as well. And it kind of goes from like most basic, like just the brief information, to more complicated if you want to kind of take a deeper dive. So check that out. We recently created some social media graphics that you might want to share with folks in your lake about HABs. So check those out. And this is also the third HABs 101 webinar we've done. So check out our earlier um, recordings if this is topics of interest, because we go through a lot of the basic information about what does a HAB look like, how do you stay safe around HABs, and a lot of other aspects. We have somebody talking about how to do a nutrient budget of a lake in the past recording. So please check those out. And thanks you all for coming, and we hope to see you at a future HABs webinar. Have a good night, everyone.